Chapter 13, Part 2. Jim panted, trying to slide his shovel under the lumps of coal again, and Nick threw his down and swore at him. He banged his hand across the back of Jim's head and came to stand behind him, reaching round Jim so that his hands were gripping the haft above Jim's own, forcing Jim to swing into his own level rhythm of shovelling and lifting, shovelling and lifting. When he let go, Jim's hands were burning. Jim did his best to keep up, lifting just 2 or 3 coals at a time to Nick's shovelful. Bending and lifting, as if this was all there was to do in the world. At last the basket was full. Nick yelled up to Whiteface, and the bucket creaked away from them as it was winched up on its rope to the top story of the building. Nick swung himself up on the hatchboards, and somehow Jim pulled himself up after, rolling well away from the dog. Day had come, as grey as pigeons. The man picked up a pail and emptied water out of it into a cooking pot on a small iron stove. "Get some more," he said to Jim. "There's a pump in the yard." As Jim jumped across to the planks of the landing stage, he heard Nick say to the dog, "Watch him, Snipe." The dog loped after him, skulking around his legs as he ran, nipping at his ankles. From the back of the warehouse, he could hear the rumble of the coals as they slid down a chute into a waiting cart. The empty basket creaked down again towards the Lily. Jim pumped water into the pail and ran as steadily as he could back to the lighter, the water slopping out against his legs as Snipe nosed around him. Nick had lit a fire on the stove, and he poured some of the water onto a mess of gruel in the cooking pot. "Stir that," he said to Jim, "and don't take all day." Jim watched over the gruel until it was beginning to thicken, then lowered himself down into the hold again and swung painfully back into Nick's rhythm. His stomach was beginning to growl with hunger. When the next basket was full, they went back up, and Nick ladled the gruel into 2 bowls. They ate it fast, squatting on their haunches by the heat of the stove, and when the basket was lowered down again, they left their bowls and set back to work. They spent the entire day shoveling coal in this way. There was tons and tons of it. From time to time, Whiteface would appear at the window and shout down to them that the cart was full and they'd have to wait for another one. At these times, they both stretched themselves full length on the hatchboards of the Lily, cold though they were. Jim would fall asleep immediately and would be kicked awake by Nick, or roused by a shout from Whiteface that the basket was coming down again. His bones seemed to set while he was asleep. He could hardly kneel or stand, but he was so afraid of Nick and of the yellow-eyed dog that he lumbered up like an old man and hobbled to his job. A long time after dark, Whiteface shouted down that he was going home and that they could finish for the day. Jim could hardly crawl by then. His shoulders felt as if they had knots of pain in them that would never undo. Nick put some potatoes in the pot and passed some water to Jim. He gurgled it down, his throat dry and parched with the coal dust, and dozed off again until the potato was ready. He ate it, clutched in his palm, burning his skin, peeling it with his teeth the way Nick did. He was glad of it and the heat from the fire. He saw that Nick ate meat with his potato and that he tossed what he didn't want to Snipe. During the entire day, he had only spoken about a dozen words to Jim. When he'd finished his meal, Nick belched loudly and climbed off the lighter onto the plankway. Jim could hear him trudging past the warehouse and up the alley, and he guessed he would be making for one of the alehouses behind the wharf. He was glad. All he wanted to do was sleep. There was a wooden locker with 2 benches, and he guessed that these were to sleep on. He rolled himself up in his sacking. He was so tired he fell asleep at once. Somehow, through his sleep, he heard Nick coming back, full of ale and good cheer. He saw him tousling Snipe's head and slipping him more meat from his pocket. He didn't take the bench next to Jim, but lowered himself down into the hold of the lighter, and Jim was glad of that too. Far out on the river, tugboats hooted. Beside Jim, the yellow dog snuffled into its paws and groaned. When Jim fell asleep again, he dreamt of his first home, the cottage. Only it was made of coal, and its walls and floors and ceilings were black and gleaming, reflecting the orange glow of the brazier. Each side of it, his mother and father sat, with their arms stretched over the warmth of the fire. His mother was just as he remembered her, pale and quiet, her dark hair smoothed back. But his father, whose face he never saw in his dreams, looked just like Grimy Nick. He had a gap between his teeth and a frothy beard and grey thatchy hair, and his face was black with coal dust, his eyes white rings like lights. Jim didn't mind in his dream because it looked like a proper home, even though it was made of coal. And it had a name, he was sure of that. It was called Lily.